I, Henrik Ibsen, sit here now in my home at Arbinsgard, these strokes having slowed my hand but not my mind, and I find myself looking back across the strange journey that has been my life. Soon I shall join the company of those who have passed beyond the veil, but perhaps now, in these final months, I can speak plainly of what I have tried to accomplish, what I have seen, what I have dared to say. The world knows me as the Norwegian dramatist, the father of modern drama, they call me. But I was not born to be a prophet in the theatre. I was born into prosperity, into what should have been a life of merchant respectability in Skien. In my childhood, Skien was an extremely joyful and festive town, quite the opposite of what it would later become. Many highly cultured, prosperous families at that time lived partly in the city itself, partly on large farms in the area. Close or more remote kinship connected most of these families amongst themselves, and balls, dinner parties and musical soirees came one after another in rapid succession both during winters and summers. My parents were members on both sides of the most respected families in Skien, and I was closely related to just about all the patrician families who then dominated the place and its surroundings. But when I was 8 years old, my father's business failed, and we sank from that world of light and celebration into the grey world of bankruptcy and social ostracism. We were forced to sell our grand house and move to that neglected farmhouse near Skien called Venstop, whose attic would later become the inspiration for the attic of the Wild Duck. The humiliation was complete. Those who had dined at our table and laughed at our soirees now turned away when they saw us in the street. My father became moody and embittered, and my mother withdrew into her quiet religiosity. I learned early what it means to fall from grace, to live on the margins, to see the hollowness behind social respectability. These lessons would serve me well in my theatre, though I did not know it then. At 15, I was apprenticed to an apothecary in Grimstad, that hamlet of some 800 souls down the coast. There I supported myself meagerly while studying nights for university admission. It was there I began to write, first that crude tragedy, Catiline, born from my Latin studies and my rage at the destruction I had witnessed. The play was published at a friend's expense and sold almost no copies, but it contained the seeds of everything that would follow. The rebellious hero, the questions of power and corruption, the individual standing against society's demands. When I failed my university examinations and could not enter academic life, fate thrust me towards the theatre. Ole Bull, that great violinist, appointed me theatre poet and stage manager at Bergen's Norwegian Theatre in 1851. For 6 years I laboured there, writing plays that mostly failed, directing productions that struggled, but learning the craft that would sustain me. I wrote nationalist dramas, trying to create what they called a national theatre. But my heart was not in those Viking sagas and medieval tales. I was searching for something deeper, more universal. When I returned to Christiania in 1857, I married my dear Susanna, and we had our son Sigurd. But I became increasingly disenchanted with life in Norway. The narrow provincialism stifled me. The political cowardice disgusted me. When Denmark fought for her duchies in 1864 and Norway refused to help, I felt such shame and rage that I could no longer breathe Norwegian air. I applied for a travel stipend and set out for Rome, not knowing I would spend the next 27 years in voluntary exile. It was in Rome that I truly found my voice. That ancient city, with its layers of history, its ruins of empire, its Catholic mysteries overlaying pagan foundations, it awakened something in me. I had been struggling with an epic poem about Brand, a fanatical priest, but the work felt lifeless, artificial. Then came that transformative day. Then one day I went into St. Peter's. I was on an errand in Rome, and there it at once dawned upon me what was a strong and clear form for what I had to say. The epic died, and the drama was born. I threw the futile experiments overboard and began to write with a freedom and inspiration I had never known. In my seclusion at Aricia, the dramatic Brand took shape with amazing swiftness. "It is blessedly peaceful out here," I wrote to Bjornson. "I have no acquaintances, and I write both morning and evening, which I never could do before." During that intense period of creation, I read nothing but the Bible. It is vigorous and strong. Brand emerged from that reading, from my fierce engagement with the absolute demands of faith and idealism. Aesthetics, I wrote to Bjornson, are as great a curse to poetry as theology to religion. I had driven every ounce of aestheticism out of myself, isolated myself, and challenged myself. Brand was my reckoning with the God of my youth, with the crushing weight of idealism upon a compromising world, the priest who demands all or nothing and destroys his family in service to his vision. He spoke to something deep in the Norwegian soul. In Norway, Brand was a tremendous popular success, even though, and in part because, its central meaning was so troubling. The success brought me an annual author's pension from the Norwegian government, something I had previously sought in vain. For the first time since my father's ruin, I was financially secure. But success also brought the obligation to explain myself, and I found I could not explain Brand without creating his opposite. Hard on the heels of Brand came Peer Gynt, another drama in rhymed verse presenting an utterly antithetical view of human nature. If Brand is a moral monolith, Peer Gynt is a capering will-o'-the-wisp, a buoyant and self-centered opportunist who is aimless, yielding and wholly unprincipled, yet who remains a lovable and beloved rascal. These two figures are interdependent and antithetical types who, under different guises, run through most of my classic work. Like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, they represent universal archetypes: the idealist and the compromiser, the man who would be himself at any cost, and the man who would be anything to survive. But even as I celebrated this success, my mind was turning towards something larger, more ambitious. A philosophical, historical drama on the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate had long been on my mind. My interest in Julian traced back to a day in 1864 when I lay under a tree listening to a friend read sections of Ammianus Marcellinus's history describing Julian's military campaigns. In 1868, I moved from Italy to Dresden, Germany, where I spent years writing the play I regarded as my main work, Emperor and Galilean. It was not to be a historical drama of the merely traditional kind. My choice of subtitle, a world historic drama, betrayed my ambitions. I admitted in my correspondence that the historical material I had been grappling with was enormous. I realized I had sacrificed years of my life to this mammoth work, a double drama in 10 acts. This was my hovedwerk, my masterpiece, though few have shared my opinion. I have always looked back on this play as the cornerstone of my entire works. In it, I developed what I consider my most important philosophical insight, the vision of the Third Empire. Through the character of Maximus, the mystic philosopher, I explored the possibility of a synthesis between what I called the empire of the flesh, the pagan celebration of earthly life, and the empire of the spirit, the Christian emphasis on transcendence. The empire of the flesh is swallowed up in the empire of the spirit, Maximus tells Julian, but the empire of the spirit is not final, any more than the youth is. You have tried to hinder the growth of the youth, to hinder him from becoming a man. This third empire represents my vision of the future, not the crushing of one worldview by another, but a new synthesis, a community of noble, harmonious development and freedom, producing a society in which no person can oppress another. I called it my first German play in a letter to Julius Hofferi, because it was in Germany that I developed this philosophical framework, influenced by the great German thinkers who were grappling with similar questions. But the world was not ready for such philosophical drama. Critics found it obscure, audiences found it overwhelming. So I turned back toward more immediate concerns, toward the present rather than the future. Moving to Munich in 1875, I began work on my first contemporary realistic drama, The Pillars of Society. Then came A Doll's House in 1879, a scathing criticism of the marital roles accepted by men and women which characterized our society. I was already in my 50s when A Doll's House was published, but I saw it as the beginning of something new. I described my later plays as that series of dramas which began with A Doll's House and which is now completed with When We Dead Awaken. Each play in this series examined a different aspect of modern life. peeling back the facades to reveal what lay beneath. Ghosts followed in 1881, and the scandal was tremendous. I dared to speak of hereditary disease, of the sins of the fathers visiting the children, of the lies that hold families together. For 20 years, the authorities would not allow ghosts to be performed in Norway. Each new play I wrote had an explosive effect on intellectual circles, greatest for A Doll's House and Ghosts, though it lessened with the later plays. But even as I wrote these realistic dramas, the past was calling to me. In 1881, I began to draft an autobiography, though I didn't get further than my boyhood. That was enough to revive memories of my sister, who was called Hedvig, my father, who was bankrupted, and suffered social ostracism, reducing the family to penury, the cramped attic where we were forced to live. These memories found their way into The Wild Duck in 1884. This new play in many ways occupies a place of its own among my dramas, I wrote to my publisher. The method is, in various respects, a departure from my earlier one. The critics will, I hope, find the points. In any case, they will find plenty to quarrel about, plenty to misinterpret. In The Wild Duck, I looked at my father through the character of old Ectel, not with the harsh judgment I had shown in earlier portrayals like John Gint, but in a conciliatory and compassionate way. During the process, Norway was characterized by political turmoil, and from my voluntary exile in Rome, I was concerned that the strength of an intimate, personal play such as The Wild Duck might drown in the political debate. But in the spring of 1884, my young relative Christopher Powers paid me an extended visit. I had not been this close to my own family since I left my hometown over 30 years ago, and I was eager to hear news regarding the family in Skien. Shortly after his visit, I declared that I had overcome a writer's block and that I writes with full force. In the summer of 1884, I completed the play in Gossensas. The Wild Duck marked another departure in my method. I was moving away from the clear moral positions of my earlier realistic plays towards something more ambiguous, more psychological. The play mingles tragedy and comedy to create what I called modern tragicomedy. Certain details that might seem important, such as who was actually Hedvig's father, whether her death was suicide or accident, I left deliberately undefined. The play focused not on clear answers, but on the dangers of forcing absolute truth upon those who need their illusions to survive. This psychological approach continued in my later works. Rosmersholm, The Lady from the Sea, Hedda Gabler, each explored the hidden recesses of the human psyche, the unconscious forces that drive our actions. I was moving toward what would become the foundation of modern psychological drama. In 1891, after 27 years abroad, I returned to Norway. The country I found was not the one I had left. My plays had contributed to changing it. The Victorian age was ending. Modernism was beginning, not only in theatre but across public life. I was welcomed as a great national figure, though many still viewed me with suspicion. My later plays, The Master Builder, Little Eyolf, John Gabriel Borkman, and finally When We Dead Awaken, became increasingly autobiographical and symbolic. In The Master Builder, I explored an artist's relation to society and his own past. The Master Builder Solness, who climbs his own tower and falls to his death, spoke to my own fears about aging, about whether my work would endure, about the price of artistic achievement. When We Dead Awaken, my final play, was perhaps my most personal. In it, I questioned my own life as an artist, wondered whether I had sacrificed too much human warmth for artistic perfection. The sculptor Rubek, who has turned his life into art but lost touch with living, faces the question that haunted my final years. What does it mean to wake up and realize you have been dead while still alive? Now, as I sit here in these final months, I see the pattern of my life's work. The boy in the cramped attic became the Bible-reading exile who envisioned the Third Empire. The fallen merchant's son became the chronicler of fallen families and impossible ideals. The provincial Norwegian became the prophet of a new age in drama. People ask me about my legacy, about my influence. They tell me I am the most frequently performed dramatist in the world after Shakespeare, that my plays have changed how we think about marriage, about truth, about the individual's relationship to society. I'm gratified by this recognition, But I know that the real test of any work is not its immediate reception, but its capacity to speak to future generations. I have tried to show people themselves, not as they pretend to be, but as they are. I have tried to ask the hard questions. What happens when absolute idealism meets human frailty? How do families survive their secrets and lies? What is the cost of truth? How do we reconcile the demands of the individual with the needs of society? What does it mean to be fully human in an age of change and uncertainty? In Brand, I showed the terrible beauty of absolute demand. In The Wild Duck, I showed the necessary mercy of human compromise. In Emperor and Galilean, I showed the possibility of synthesis, of a third way beyond the conflicts that tear us apart. Each work was a station on the journey toward understanding what it means to be human in the modern world. They called me a revolutionary, a destroyer of social values. But I was never a revolutionary in the political sense. I was a prophet trying to hold up a mirror to my age, trying to show people the contradictions and possibilities of their own lives. My business, I once said, is to ask questions, not to answer them. The questions I asked were dangerous because they challenged the comfortable lies by which society maintains itself. But they were necessary questions because only by facing them honestly could we hope to grow, to change, to become more fully human. I do not know if I succeeded in creating that third empire I envisioned in Emperor and Galilean. But I know I have been faithful to my vision, true to what I saw in St. Peter's that day, when the strong and clear form of what I had to say first dawned upon me. I have written what I saw, said what I knew, asked the questions that demanded to be asked. The work is done. Let them quarrel about it now. Let them find plenty to misinterpret, as they always have. But let them also find the truth I tried to show them, the truth about themselves, about their families, about the age we have lived through together. My last words: the newspapers will no doubt make something dramatic of them, but I say simply this: the individual must be free to become himself, to ask his own questions, to find his own truth. That is the message of all my work. That is what I have lived for, what I have written for. The curtain falls, the play is ended, but the questions remain.